October 18th, 1943, the village of Colvi Vecchia, Italy. British troops had just taken the small town after days of brutal fighting against German forces. But what they didn't know was that American bombers were already in the air, preparing to level the entire village in exactly 30 minutes. The communication lines were down, radio equipment destroyed. There was no way to stop the attack that would kill over 1,000 Allied soldiers. No way, except for one small pigeon with blue checkered feathers and an aluminum band marked USA 43SC6390. His name was G.I. Joe. But before we dive into this incredible true story of courage and sacrifice, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more amazing historical stories like this one. The morning had started with cautious optimism. Captain Richard Brown of the British 56th Infantry Division stood on the cobblestone streets of Colvi Vecchia, watching his exhausted men clear the last pockets of resistance. The October sun cast long shadows across the damaged buildings, their terracotta roofs punctured by artillery fire. Smoke still rose from several structures, mixing with the morning fog that clung to the valley below. This village wasn't strategic in the grand scheme of the Italian campaign, but it sat along a crucial supply route. For 3 days, they had fought house to house, room to room. The German defenders had been tenacious, making them pay for every meter of ground. But finally, just before dawn, the last German soldier had retreated, or surrendered. Captain Brown wiped the grime from his face and looked at his watch. 0630 hours. The men deserved rest, hot food, maybe even a few hours of sleep. But first, they needed to establish a perimeter and get communications restored. That's when Lieutenant James Mitchell approached, his face pale beneath the dirt. Lieutenant Mitchell's hands were shaking slightly as he saluted. He was young, maybe 23, with red hair that stuck out from under his helmet. He had been working with the Signal Corps, trying to restore radio contact with headquarters. The radio equipment is completely destroyed, sir. The Germans sabotaged it before they left. We've got nothing, no way to contact command. Captain Brown felt his stomach tighten. This was worse than he thought. Standard operating procedure required immediate confirmation when a town was taken, especially one that had been marked for aerial bombardment. What about the field telephone lines? Cut, sir. All of them. We've sent runners, but they won't reach headquarters for at least 2 hours. Maybe more if they run into German patrols. The captain's mind raced through the tactical situation. Allied command had planned a massive bombing run on Colvi Vecchia for 0700 hours. That was in 30 minutes. The plan had been to soften up German defenses before the British infantry attack. But the attack had succeeded faster than anyone anticipated. Now, over 1,000 British soldiers were occupying the very buildings that American bombers were about to destroy. Get every man out of the buildings. Now, move them to the fields south of town. We've got maybe 25 minutes. But even as he gave the order, Captain Brown knew it wasn't enough. The American bombing raids were thorough and devastating. The blast radius would extend far beyond the village itself. Men in the open fields would still be vulnerable to shrapnel and concussive force. They needed to stop the bombers, not just take cover. That's when Corporal David Williams approached. He was a quiet man from Cornwall, 32 years old, who had served as a pigeon handler in the Great War. When this war started, he had volunteered again, specifically requesting assignment to the Army Pigeon Service. Most soldiers mocked the idea of using birds for communication in modern warfare, but veterans like Williams knew better. When everything else failed, pigeons worked. Sir, I have G.I. Joe. He's American, one of the best flyers in the service. He's made runs longer than this before. If anyone can reach headquarters in time, it's him. Captain Brown looked at the small bird in the wooden carrier that Williams held. G.I. Joe appeared unremarkable at first glance, just another pigeon with checkered blue and gray feathers. But Williams handled him with the care of someone managing precious cargo. How long would it take? The flight to headquarters is approximately 20 miles. In optimal conditions, G.I. Joe can fly at speeds up to 60 miles per hour. We're looking at 20 minutes, maybe 25, if wind conditions aren't favorable. That cuts it incredibly close. The bombers will already be approaching. It's the only chance we have, sir. Captain Brown made the decision in seconds. Sometimes in war, you had to trust in things that seemed absurd. Sometimes the fate of 1,000 men came down to the wings of a single bird. Do it. Send everything we know. Town is secured, friendly forces in occupation. Abort the bombing run. Use priority code red. Corporal Williams moved with practiced efficiency. He carefully removed G.I. Joe from the carrier, speaking softly to the bird as he attached the small aluminum capsule to his leg. Inside the capsule was a tightly rolled piece of paper with the message written in clear, concise military terminology. The men around them had stopped working to watch. Word had spread quickly through the unit about what was happening. Soldiers who, minutes before, had been joking about using carrier pigeons now watched in tense silence. Their lives depended on this bird reaching headquarters before the bombers arrived. Williams held G.I. Joe up, feeling the bird's heartbeat against his palms. The pigeon's eyes were bright, alert. Williams had trained dozens of birds over the years, and he knew quality when he saw it. G.I. Joe had that rare combination of speed, endurance, and homing instinct that separated ordinary pigeons from legends. All right, Joe, this is the big one. Everything we've trained for comes down to this. Take the message home, boy. Fly like you've never flown before. He launched the bird into the air with a smooth, practiced motion. G.I. Joe's wings caught the morning air, beating powerfully as he gained altitude. The pigeon circled once over the village, orienting himself, then turned northeast toward the Allied headquarters 20 miles away. Within seconds, he was a dark speck against the brightening sky, then gone entirely. The men watched until they could no longer see him. Then, slowly, they began moving toward the southern fields as ordered. But everyone kept glancing at the sky, wondering if the bird would make it, wondering if their next sight would be American bombers appearing over the horizon. Captain Brown checked his watch again. 0635. 25 minutes until the scheduled bombing run. Even if G.I. Joe made perfect time, it would take at least 20 minutes to reach headquarters. That left 5 minutes to confirm the message, contact the bomber squadron, and issue the abort order. It was almost impossibly tight. Lieutenant Mitchell stood beside him, also watching the sky. Do you think he'll make it, sir? The captain didn't answer immediately. He thought about all the things that could go wrong. A hawk could attack the pigeon mid-flight. A stray bullet from a German patrol could bring him down. Weather conditions could slow him. He could simply lose his way, though that was unlikely for a bird of G.I. Joe's caliber. I don't know, but I do know that bird is our only hope. Start getting the men to the fields, and have everyone spread out as much as possible. If those bombers come, I want minimum casualties. G.I. Joe flew with singular purpose through the Italian morning sky. The pigeon's brain, though small, contained remarkable navigation abilities that scientists wouldn't fully understand for decades. He could sense the Earth's magnetic field, use the sun's position for orientation, and recognize visual landmarks from thousands of feet in the air. Every training flight he had completed, every message he had carried had prepared him for this moment. Below him, the Italian countryside rolled past. Olive groves and vineyards, many damaged by the fighting, created a patchwork of green and brown. Small rivers glinted silver in the morning light. Here and there, columns of smoke marked where battles still raged. The war had transformed this beautiful landscape into something tragic and scarred. G.I. Joe climbed higher, finding a favorable wind current. The air was cold at this altitude, but his body was built for this, every feather optimized for efficient flight. His wings beat in a rhythm that could be sustained for hours if necessary. His heart, proportionally larger than a human's, pumped oxygenated blood to powerful flight muscles. 10 minutes into the flight, G.I. Joe passed over a German artillery position. Soldiers on the ground didn't notice the small bird flying 500 feet above them. They were focused on their own tactical situation, preparing for what they expected would be another day of defensive fighting. They had no idea that the single pigeon overhead was carrying information that would save over 1,000 Allied lives. Back in Colvivecchia, the evacuation was proceeding as quickly as possible. British soldiers filed out of the village buildings where they had been setting up defensive positions. They moved into the fields south of town, spreading out as ordered. Many of them were veterans who had survived the North Africa campaign. They had learned to trust their officers' instincts, even when orders seemed strange. Sergeant Robert Thompson, a 35-year-old career soldier from Manchester, helped organize the evacuation. He had been in the Army for 15 years, long enough to see technology change warfare in fundamental ways. Tanks, aircraft, radio communications, all of it was supposed to make war more efficient, more controllable. And yet, here they were, depending on a pigeon. He found himself thinking about his son back home, 8 years old, who loved feeding the birds in their garden. The boy would be fascinated to know that his father's life might be saved by a pigeon. If they survived this, Thompson promised himself he would write home and tell his son the whole story. The minutes crawled past. 0645, 0650. The sky remained empty, no bombers yet, but everyone knew they could appear at any moment. American B-25. Mitchell bombers would come in low and fast, giving minimal warning before their payload of 500-pound bombs transformed the village into rubble. Captain Brown stood in the field with his men, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the sky in both directions. Northeast for any sign that G.I. Joe had succeeded, that the message had gotten through. West for the bombers that might come regardless. G.I. Joe was 15 minutes into his flight, approaching the halfway point. His navigation was perfect, his speed consistent. The pigeon had no way to understand the importance of his mission in human terms. He didn't know about the 1,000 soldiers whose lives depended on him. He only knew his purpose: carry the message home, reach the loft at headquarters where food and safety waited. A hawk spotted him at 16 minutes, a natural predator drawn by the sight of a lone pigeon in open sky. The hawk was larger, faster in a dive, a perfect killing machine. It began to stoop, wings tucked, dropping like a missile toward G.I. Joe. But pigeons hadn't survived as a species for millions of years without developing their own survival strategies. G.I. Joe sensed the danger, some instinct warning him of the attack from above. He folded his wings and dropped into a controlled dive, then pulled up sharply and changed direction. The hawk's talons closed on empty air where the pigeon had been a second before. G.I. Joe flew lower now, using the terrain for cover, making himself a harder target. The hawk made one more attempt, then gave up and turned away to find easier prey. The pigeon had lost perhaps 30 seconds in the encounter, but he was safe and still on course. 18 minutes, 19 minutes. G.I. Joe could see the Allied headquarters now, a collection of buildings and tents on the outskirts of a larger town. He recognized the loft building, a converted barn with entry ports along the roof. This was home, the place he had been trained to return to no matter what. At headquarters, Master Sergeant Harold Ross was performing routine duties in the pigeon loft. At 41, he was too old for frontline service, but his expertise with messenger pigeons made him valuable. He had been working with military birds since 1918, and he had never lost his respect for their capabilities. He heard the arrival bell ring, a small device that alerted handlers when a pigeon entered the loft. Moving quickly, Ross went to check which bird had arrived. When he saw it was G.I. Joe, coming in hard and fast from the southwest, he knew immediately that something critical had happened. This pigeon was one of their best, assigned to the British 56th Division. He wouldn't be flying in the middle of a scheduled bombing run unless there was an emergency. Ross carefully captured G.I. Joe and removed the message capsule from his leg. His hands trembled slightly as he unrolled the thin paper and read the message. His eyes widened. He looked at the clock on the wall. 0654. The bombing run was scheduled to begin in 6 minutes. He ran from the loft, still holding the message, shouting for the duty officer. Soldiers looked up in surprise as the normally reserved sergeant sprinted across the compound. He burst into the operations building, where Lieutenant Colonel Charles Webb was reviewing morning reports. Sir, priority message from the 56th Division. The message came by pigeon, just arrived. Colvi Vecchia has been secured. Friendly forces are in occupation. We need to abort the bombing run immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Webb grabbed the message, read it quickly, then reached for the telephone. He was connected to the Air Operations Center in seconds. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. This is Lieutenant Colonel Webb at headquarters. I need to issue an immediate abort order for the Colvi Vecchia bombing mission. The target has been secured by friendly forces. Repeat, abort the mission. Authorization code follows. There was a pause, then the voice came back. Sir, the squadron is already airborne. They departed 8 minutes ago. We can reach them by radio, but they're approaching the target area now. Do it. Whatever it takes, stop those bombers. We have over 1,000 British troops in that village. Back in the fields south of Colvi Vecchia, the British soldiers heard them before they saw them. The distinctive sound of aircraft engines growing louder. Captain Brown's heart sank. They were out of time. G.I. Joe hadn't made it, or the message hadn't gotten through, or there simply hadn't been enough time to stop the attack. The bombers appeared from the west, a formation of B-25s flying low, just as expected. They were close enough that Brown could see the details of the aircraft, the American star insignia on their wings. Beautiful machines, deadly machines, coming to destroy his men. Some of the soldiers began to pray. Others grabbed their helmets, as if that thin metal would protect them from 500-pound bombs. A few stood and stared, fatalistic, knowing that if those bombs fell, there was nothing they could do. Then something changed. The lead bomber in the formation waggled its wings. It was a signal. The entire formation began to turn, pulling away from their attack run. They circled the village once, close enough that the men on the ground could see the pilots in the cockpits. One pilot waved. Then the bombers turned west and flew away, their payload still secure in their bomb bays. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Lieutenant Mitchell started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that spread through the ranks. Men were hugging each other, shouting, some dropping to their knees in relief. They had come within seconds of being killed by their own aircraft. Captain Brown closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them, he looked northeast, toward the headquarters where a small pigeon had just saved over 1,000 lives. He made it. That incredible bird actually made it. Corporal Williams was crying openly, not ashamed of the tears running down his face. He had trusted G.I. Joe completely, but even he hadn't been certain they would make it in time. The margin had been impossibly thin. If the bird had been even 2 minutes slower, if the hawk had caught him, if the message hadn't been clear enough, or if the duty officer had delayed even slightly, they would all be dead. The evacuation order was canceled. The men returned to the village, but now with a different attitude. They treated the buildings more carefully. set up their positions with more attention to detail. They had been given a second chance at life, and they weren't going to waste it. Word spread quickly through the division about what had happened. Soldiers who had mocked the idea of carrier pigeons suddenly wanted to know everything about them, how they were trained, how they navigated, what made G.I. Joe special. Corporal Williams found himself telling the story dozens of times over the next few days. But the bird himself was already back at headquarters, eating his well-earned meal of corn and peas, unaware that he had just completed one of the most significant missions in military pigeon history. Master Sergeant Ross checked him over carefully, making sure the flight hadn't caused any injuries. G.I. Joe was tired but healthy, his mission complete. The official report, filed by Lieutenant Colonel Webb, documented the facts with military precision. At 06:54 hours on October 18th, 1943, Pigeon USA's 43 Gores C6390, nicknamed G.I. Joe, arrived at Allied headquarters carrying a message that Colvi Vecchia had been secured by friendly forces. The message was received with 6 minutes to spare before a scheduled bombing run. An abort order was immediately issued and successfully transmitted to the bomber squadron. The estimated number of Allied lives saved by this action was calculated at 1,043 personnel. But numbers on a report couldn't capture the full reality of what had happened. Captain Brown wrote a letter of commendation that emphasized not just the technical achievement, but the courage involved. He wrote about the 20-mile flight through hostile territory, about the split-second timing that made the difference between life and death, about the faith his men had placed in a small bird when all modern technology had failed them. The story reached beyond military circles. Journalists got hold of it, and suddenly G.I. Joe became famous. Newspapers ran headlines about the pigeon who saved 1,000 soldiers. Radio broadcasts told the story. For a brief moment in the middle of a brutal war, people could focus on something that felt almost miraculous. In December 1943, G.I. Joe was awarded the Dickon Medal, the highest honor for animal bravery in British military service. The medal was established in 1943 by Maria Dickon, founder of the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, to recognize animals serving in war. G.I. Joe was the first non-British animal to receive it. The ceremony was held at the Tower of London, a location chosen for its historical significance. Military officials, journalists, and curious civilians filled the space. Master Sergeant Ross carried G.I. Joe into the ceremony, the pigeon calm despite the unusual surroundings and the crowd of people. Major General Charles Hayden of the British Army presented the medal. He spoke about the long history of animals serving alongside soldiers, from horses to dogs to pigeons. He talked about how modern warfare created new challenges, but also revealed that sometimes the oldest solutions were the most reliable. This pigeon, G.I. Joe, represents something important that we must never forget. Technology can fail, equipment can be destroyed, but courage, determination, and the ability to accomplish a mission against all odds, these qualities transcend whether you're human or animal. This bird flew 20 miles in 20 minutes to save over 1,000 lives. That is heroism in its purest form. The Dickon Medal was attached to G.I. Joe's carrier, and photographers captured the moment. The pigeon looked into the cameras with the same calm intelligence he always showed, unaware that he had become a symbol of something larger than himself. Corporal Williams stood in the back of the room watching the ceremony. He thought about all the pigeons he had trained over the years, the ones who had made it back and the ones who hadn't. Each bird was unique, but G.I. Joe had something special. Maybe it was his speed, or his navigation ability, or just his determination. Whatever it was, Williams was grateful to have worked with him. After the ceremony, G.I. Joe returned to active service. He would fly many more missions before the war ended, carrying messages across dangerous skies, always returning to his loft. But none of those missions would match the drama and impact of that October morning in Colvi Vecchia. The war in Italy continued for another year and a half. The British 56th Division fought in dozens more engagements, slowly pushing north through some of the most difficult terrain of the European theater. Many of the men who had been saved by G.I. Joe's flight would not survive the war. Some died in the mountains near Cassino, others during the Po Valley offensive. Captain Brown was wounded in early 1944 and sent back to England. Lieutenant Mitchell made it all the way to the end, returning home in 1946 with medals for valor and scars that would never fully heal. But every man who served with the 56th Division carried the story of G.I. Joe. They told it in letters home, in conversations with other soldiers, and later to children and grandchildren who wanted to understand what the war had been like. It became part of the division's identity, a reminder that sometimes survival came down to unexpected things. After the war ended, G.I. Joe was retired from military service. He was returned to the United States, where he lived out his remaining years at the Army Pigeon Service Facility in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. He died in 1961, having lived an exceptionally long life for a pigeon 18 years old. Even in death, G.I. Joe's story continued to resonate. His body was preserved and placed on display at the United States Army Communications and Electronics Museum at Fort Monmouth. Visitors could see the actual pigeon who had saved over 1,000 lives, could read the citations and commendations, could understand how one small bird had made such a significant difference. The Colvivecchia incident became a teaching example in military communication courses. It was used to illustrate the importance of redundancy in communication systems, the value of preparing for worst-case scenarios, and the fact that sometimes the simplest solutions were the most effective. Modern military planners studied what had happened, analyzing how close the disaster had come and what lessons could be applied to future operations. Sergeant Robert Thompson, the Manchester soldier who had helped evacuate the village, did write that letter to his son. He told the whole story of G.I. Joe, describing the pigeon's flight and the minutes of uncertainty when they waited to see if the bird had made it in time. His son kept that letter for the rest of his life and eventually donated it to the Imperial War Museum, where it became part of their collection of personal narratives from the Second World War. Corporal Williams continued working with military pigeons until the service was disbanded in the 1950s. He always maintained that G.I. Joe was the best bird he had ever trained, not because of that one famous flight, but because of the consistent excellence the pigeon demonstrated over years of service. Williams gave lectures about military pigeons, appeared at veteran events, and worked to preserve the history of the Army Pigeon Service before it was forgotten. The village of Colvivecchia was rebuilt after the war. The residents who returned to their homes learned about the British soldiers who had fought there and the American pigeon who had saved them. In 1993, on the 50th anniversary of the incident, the village erected a small memorial. It showed a pigeon in flight, with a plaque in both Italian and English explaining what had happened there in October 1943. The memorial became a stop for military historians and tourists interested in lesser-known stories from the war. Veterans of the 56th Division, who were still alive, made pilgrimages there, standing in the rebuilt square and remembering when those buildings had been damaged and dangerous, when they had waited in the fields wondering if American bombers would appear over the horizon. The technology that had failed that October morning in Colvivecchia, the radio equipment and telephone lines, would become exponentially more sophisticated in the decades after the war. Satellite communications, digital encryption, networks that could route around damage, all of it made the scenario of complete communication failure seem like something from the distant past. But military historians and planners knew better than to assume technology would always work. They studied incidents like Colvivecchia as reminders that backup systems mattered, that low-tech solutions still had value, that in the chaos of war, the unexpected could always happen. G.I. Joe's legacy extended beyond the military realm. The story captured public imagination because it represented something people wanted to believe about the world, that courage and determination mattered, that small things could have enormous impacts, that in moments of crisis the most unlikely heroes could emerge. Children's books were written about G.I. Joe. School projects focused on him. He appeared in documentaries about World War II and in broader histories of animals and warfare. Each retelling emphasized different aspects of the story, the technical achievement of the flight, the human drama of the soldiers waiting to see if they would survive, the split-second timing that made the difference between disaster and deliverance. In academic circles, the Colvivecchia incident became a case study in military decision-making under uncertainty. Captain Brown had made the choice to trust a pigeon when every modern instinct said it couldn't work, that 20 miles in the time remaining was impossible, that putting the lives of over 1,000 men in the wings of a bird was absurd. But he had made that choice, and it had worked, and that raised interesting questions about leadership, about calculated risk-taking, about when to trust unconventional solutions. The story also served as a reminder of the role that ordinary soldiers played in extraordinary circumstances. Captain Brown was a career officer, but not a particularly high-ranking one. Corporal Williams was a pigeon handler, a position that most soldiers considered unglamorous at best. Master Sergeant Ross was stationed at headquarters, far from the front lines. None of them were supposed to be heroes, and yet their actions had prevented a catastrophe. That democratization of heroism resonated with veterans of all wars. It acknowledged that courage wasn't just found in dramatic charges or desperate last stands. Sometimes it was found in the decision to launch a pigeon, in the care taken to train that pigeon properly, and the quick thinking to read a message and understand its urgency. Heroism was doing your job with excellence when it mattered most. The connection between humans and animals in military service became another lasting theme of G.I. Joe's story. For thousands of years, humans had depended on animals in warfare. Horses carried cavalry into battle, dogs detected mines and guarded installations, elephants transported supplies, and pigeons carried messages when nothing else could get through. The relationship between Corporal Williams and G.I. Joe illustrated something important about these partnerships. Williams didn't view the pigeon as a tool or a piece of equipment. He understood the bird as an individual with capabilities and limitations, strengths and vulnerabilities. That understanding made him a better handler, and it made G.I. Joe a better messenger pigeon. Modern military forces still work with animals, though the specific roles have changed. Dogs are used for detection work and patrol duties. Horses are still used in some specialized units. Dolphins and sea lions are trained for naval operations. The fundamental principle remains the same. Animals can accomplish things that technology cannot, and the bond between human handler and animal partner is a force multiplier that increases the effectiveness of both. G.I. Joe's story reminds us that war, despite all its technology and planning, despite its strategic complexity and tactical sophistication, ultimately comes down to moments of individual action. One pigeon flying 20 miles, one sergeant recognizing the urgency of a message, one colonel immediately issuing an abort order. Each of these small actions was necessary, and together they prevented a tragedy. The 1,043 men who were saved by G.I. Joe's flight went on to live lives that those statistics can barely capture. They returned home, or they didn't. They started families, or they remained alone. They talked about their experiences, or they kept silent. But each of them carried the knowledge that they had come within minutes of being killed by friendly fire, and that a pigeon had saved them. Some of them never forgot it. They told their children and grandchildren about G.I. Joe, about watching the bombers turn away, about the impossible relief of surviving what should have been unsurvivable. Others tried to move past the war entirely, to focus on building new lives and not dwelling on close calls and might-have-beens. Both responses were understandable. Both were valid. The story of G.I. Joe represents something essential about military history, the importance of remembering not just the big battles and famous generals, but also the small moments that made a difference, the thousands of individual decisions and actions that collectively determined outcomes, the unglamorous work that didn't make headlines but saved lives. It also represents something about how we understand heroism. G.I. Joe didn't choose to be a hero. He was a pigeon, following his training and his instincts, flying home because that's what he had been conditioned to do. But in that flight, in that 20-minute span when everything hung in the balance, he became something more than just a bird carrying a message. He became a symbol of courage, determination, and the power of doing your job with excellence when it matters most. The Dickin Medal that G.I. Joe received sits now in a museum, a physical reminder of that October morning in 1943. Visitors can see it, can read the citation, can learn about what happened. But the real memorial to G.I. Joe isn't in museums or monuments. It's in the lives that were saved, the families that were started, the generations that came after, because a pigeon flew fast enough to beat the bombers. Captain Brown lived until 1987, long enough to see the world change in ways he never could have imagined during the war. He kept a photograph of himself with G.I. Joe, taken sometime after the Colvi Vecchia incident. In interviews late in his life, he always spoke about the pigeon with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, how close they had come to disaster and how unlikely their salvation had been. The lesson of G.I. Joe isn't just about carrier pigeons or military communications. It's about adaptability, about using whatever resources are available to accomplish critical missions. It's about trusting in proven methods even when they seem outdated. It's about the courage to make difficult decisions under pressure and the importance of preparation and training before crisis moments arrive. Modern warfare has moved far beyond carrier pigeons. Communication systems are sophisticated beyond anything that Captain Brown or Corporal Williams could have imagined in 1943. But the fundamental challenges remain: how to maintain communications in hostile environments, how to make critical decisions with incomplete information, how to prevent friendly fire incidents, how to save lives when everything seems to be going wrong. G.I. Joe's 20-minute flight from Colvi Vecchia to Allied headquarters represents more than just a successful mission. It represents a moment when the old ways proved their worth, when simple solutions solved complex problems, when a single small creature made the difference between catastrophe and survival. That October morning, as the British soldiers watched the bombers turn away and realized they were going to live, they understood something profound about the nature of war and survival. Sometimes you live because of superior tactics or better equipment or overwhelming force. And sometimes you live because a pigeon flew just fast enough, because a sergeant recognized urgency, because a colonel acted decisively, because a handler had trained his bird well. G.I. Joe was officially retired from service in 1946, having completed his missions with distinction. He lived out his remaining years in comfortable circumstances, well-fed and well-cared for, honored by those who understood what he had accomplished. When he died in 1961, obituaries ran in newspapers around the world. He had outlived many of the men he saved, had witnessed the world change from wartime to peacetime, had seen technology advance far beyond what existed in his operational days. But his story endures because it speaks to something timeless. In moments of crisis, when everything modern fails, sometimes the solution comes from unexpected places. Sometimes heroism wears feathers. Sometimes the difference between life and death is measured in the beating of wings against sky, in the navigation of a small brain that somehow knows the way home, in the 20 minutes it takes to fly 20 miles and change the course of 1,000 lives. The soldiers who were saved that day eventually died of other causes, in other years, in other places, but they lived longer than they would have, saw more, experienced more, loved more, all because of those extra minutes that G.I. Joe gave them. That is the true measure of his achievement, not the medal or the honors, not the historical significance or the technical excellence of the flight, but simply the lives that continued because he flew fast enough and true enough to beat the bombers to headquarters. And somewhere in the archives, preserved alongside military documents and strategic analyses and after-action reports, is the small aluminum message capsule that G.I. Joe carried that morning. Inside, still legible after more than 80 years, is the message that saved 1,000 lives. Colvi Vecchia secured by friendly forces. Abort bombing run. Priority code red. 12 words that made all the difference. 20 miles that changed everything. One pigeon who became a legend.